Voiceover begins with a suspenseful tone. Have you ever wondered what secrets lie behind the doors of a millionaire's world? When Nathaniel Grant opened his hotel door, he expected a housekeeper. He never imagined a 7-year-old girl with a rag or the truth that would change his life forever. Nathaniel Grant never answered his own hotel room door. In all his years of business travel, it had become standard protocol for staff to come and go without needing his acknowledgement. The world of five-star hotels was designed for seamlessness, suites cleaned when guests were out, meals delivered discreetly, and privacy respected above all else. But on that particular Tuesday afternoon, something made him get up and open the door himself. He was in his usual place at the sleek glass desk reviewing projections for a hotel opening in Singapore when the soft knock came. It wasn't rushed or loud. It was almost hesitant. He opened the door, expecting one of the usual housekeepers, or perhaps a room service tray left unattended. But what he saw stopped him cold. Standing in front of him was a little girl, no older than 7, with large brown eyes and tangled brown hair tied in a low ponytail. She wore a faded red dress, a black and white apron that looked like it belonged to a maid's uniform, and clutched a rag in one hand. Her shoes were scuffed, her posture straight, and her face serious. There was no name tag, no badge, no adult nearby. Just her, standing silently in the hallway of the executive floor of the most exclusive hotel in the city. Nathaniel stared at her, stunned. "Are you lost?" he asked finally, his voice caught between disbelief and concern. The girl shook her head and answered matter-of-factly, "No, sir. I'm here to clean your room." He blinked. "You work here?" She nodded, stepping forward slightly. "Yes, mister. I'm assigned to this floor today." Nathaniel stepped aside instinctively to let her pass, his mind racing. She walked inside like she belonged there, scanning the room with practiced eyes, then setting down a small supply bag near the wall. She moved toward the bed and began smoothing the sheets with quiet efficiency. He couldn't bring himself to move. The silence in the suite suddenly felt oppressive. He reached for the hotel phone and dialed the front desk. "This is Grant in 417, he said, keeping his voice low. "Can someone please explain why a child is cleaning my room?" The receptionist's tone shifted awkwardly. "One moment, sir. I'll connect you to Mr. Carter." A few seconds later, Ben Carter, the hotel manager, picked up. "Mr. Grant, good afternoon. I understand there's been some confusion." Nathaniel didn't hide his frustration. "Confusion? There's a little girl scrubbing my linens." Ben hesitated, then said, "That's Ellie Thompson. She's part of our extended housekeeping program. Her situation is unique. Her family's been with us for years. It's temporary. She's supervised." "She's alone," Nathaniel said coldly, "in a luxury suite with a rag. We try to support our employees however we can. Her grandmother is." "I don't want excuses. I want answers." Nathaniel ended the call before Carter could finish. He turned back to the girl. She was now dusting the lamp by the window, humming softly to herself. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't clumsy. She moved like she had done this many times before. He took a breath and approached her slowly. "Ellie, right?" She nodded without looking up. "How long have you been working here?" "Since I was 5. Only sometimes, she replied. When my grandma gets tired. He stared at her, trying to process her words. She wasn't even old enough to understand how wrong this was, how out of place she should have felt. And yet she belonged here more than he did. Something cracked in his chest as he stood there in his expensive gray suit, watching a child wipe down his $5,000 marble coffee table like it was normal, like it was fair. He didn't know her story yet, but he knew enough to understand that whatever brought her here, it wasn't by choice. It was survival. And as much as he hated to admit it, she had already walked further in life than most people he knew. He didn't stop her. Not yet. But he watched her. Every move, every small quiet breath, because something told him that this wasn't just a cleaning, it was a beginning. The next morning, Nathaniel Grant found himself distracted during a conference call with the hotel's regional directors. He sat in the executive lounge, a tablet open in front of him, but his mind was far from occupancy rates and Q3 projections. His thoughts kept drifting back to room 417, to the tiny pair of hands that had dusted his luxury suite with practiced precision, to the girl who called herself a maid, but looked like she should have been playing with dolls or learning multiplication tables. He hadn't told anyone what he saw, not beyond his sharp conversation with Ben Carter, who had followed up with an apologetic voicemail explaining the hotel's special circumstances and offering to reassign his cleaning schedule to someone more suitable. But Nathaniel didn't return the call. He didn't want excuses packaged in polite hospitality speak. He wanted the truth. After the meeting, he took the elevator down to the employee level. He didn't normally step foot in this part of his empire. It was the behind-the-scenes world of laundry carts, supply shelves, locker rooms, and break rooms where his employees existed outside the polished illusion they presented to guests. The floor smelled like detergent and bleach, and there was a buzz of activity as staff moved quickly from one task to the next. Most people didn't recognize him immediately without the usual entourage, but a few froze when they saw who had just walked in. He ignored their surprised expressions and walked straight toward the small housekeeping office tucked at the end of the corridor. Inside, he found Mrs. Martinez, the senior maid, sorting linen orders. She looked up with a startled expression when he entered. "Mr. Grant," she said, immediately straightening, her voice a mixture of respect and fear. "Is everything all right?" "I'm not here for formalities," he said, his tone firm but calm. "I want to know about Ellie Thompson, the little girl who cleaned my room yesterday." Mrs. Martinez blinked and looked down at the clipboard in her hand. She's a good girl, works hard, smarter than most of the adults here, to be honest, but it's not what it looks like." "Then explain it to me," Nathaniel said, crossing his arms. She hesitated. Her grandmother, Gloria, worked here for almost 2 decades. One of the best we had. She raised Ellie on her own. No parents in the picture. A couple years ago, Gloria had a stroke. Couldn't keep up with the job. She refused to leave the apartment the hotel gave her because it was all she had left. So Ellie started helping, at first just bringing clean towels, then tidying rooms. We didn't ask her to. She insisted. Said they didn't have food. And no one stopped her. "You mean no one cared enough to intervene?" Nathaniel said coldly. "No," Mrs. Martinez said softly. "We cared. We just didn't have the power to do anything else." Carter knew. He turned a blind eye. Said if the guests didn't complain, it wasn't a problem. Nathaniel didn't respond right away. He looked at the calendar on the wall, the list of shifts, the supply checklist written in careful script. This place functioned because people like Mrs. Martinez carried it on their backs, because girls like Ellie gave more than they should ever have to. "Where do they live?" he asked. Mrs. Martinez looked uncertain, but then she sighed and gave him the address. "But please, Mr. Grant, don't scare her. She's had enough of that already." He left without another word and took a car to the edge of the city, where the skyline faded into worn buildings and sidewalks cracked by years of neglect. The address led him to a gray apartment block with peeling paint and flickering hallway lights. He climbed the stairs and knocked on the door of Unit 3B. No answer. He knocked again. After a long moment, the door creaked open and Ellie stood there barefoot, wearing a too big t-shirt and holding a plastic cup of water. She looked at him like she wasn't surprised. "I knew you'd come," she said. Nathaniel looked past her and saw a bed by the window where an elderly woman lay sleeping, her chest rising and falling slowly, her skin pale and thin. The room was sparse: 2 chairs, a hot plate, an old TV. Nothing else. "Why didn't you tell someone?" he asked quietly. Ellie shrugged. "We tried, but no one listened, or they left." Nathaniel stepped inside and closed the door gently behind him. He knelt so he could look at her at eye level. "I'm listening now." And in that moment, something shifted. Not just for him, for her, too. Because this time, the man at the door wasn't there to be served. He was there to stay. The air inside the small apartment felt heavy with silence. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but rather the result of exhaustion, illness, and years of survival. Nathaniel stood just inside the doorway of Unit 3B, absorbing every detail, as if each object might explain something he didn't yet understand. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, and the only source of light was a small desk lamp flickering weakly on the kitchen counter. The bed, positioned in the far corner beneath a cracked window, held the fragile figure of Ellie's grandmother. Her hands lay still atop the blanket, her chest rising and falling in a slow, labored rhythm. It was clear she was too weak to speak, perhaps too weak to even open her eyes. Ellie stood beside the bed, gently adjusting the blanket near the woman's shoulder. Her movements were small and practiced, the way a child learns not from being taught but from doing something again and again because no one else will. She didn't rush. She didn't ask for help. She moved with the solemn precision of someone who understood too much for her age. Nathaniel sat down carefully in the only available chair, a wobbly wooden one beside the kitchenette. He looked around, noting the single shelf of canned food, the absence of a refrigerator, the outdated microwave on the floor. It wasn't a home. It was a shelter barely holding itself together. "How long have you been living like this?" he asked, his voice low but clear. Ellie didn't look up. "Since Grandma got sick. Almost 2 years now." She said it like a fact, not a complaint. "She worked in your hotel since before I was born. We used to live in the staff housing behind the building, but they made her leave when she couldn't work anymore. Mrs. Martinez said this place was empty, so we moved in, and the hotel never stepped in." Nathaniel asked, though he already knew the answer. "They didn't care. Mr. Carter said we weren't employees anymore." She turned and met his gaze. "But I was. I cleaned. I helped. You're a child, Ellie, he said gently. Her jaw tightened slightly. I'm also hungry. The words hit him harder than any boardroom negotiation or investor meeting ever had. He looked again at the thin layer of dust on the counter, the small stack of unpaid medical bills neatly tucked beside the lamp, and he felt something inside him twist. For years, he'd prided himself on efficiency, on running a global empire without mess or failure. But here was a mess he had ignored. Not in another country or another office, but under his very roof. One of his employees, his people, had collapsed, and no one had caught her except a 7-year-old girl with a rag and a wool made of iron. Nathaniel pulled his phone from his pocket and opened his notes. He quickly typed out a list. Groceries, a new mattress, medical supplies, an in-home nurse, school enrollment contacts, legal consultation for guardianship status. It wasn't out of charity. It was out of responsibility, because somewhere along the line, he had become part of this story. And now he had to decide whether he would stay in it. Ellie watched him type with cautious curiosity. What are you doing? I'm fixing what I should have noticed a long time ago, he said. But you're not going back to work, Ellie. That ends today. She took a small step closer. Then how will we eat? He looked her in the eye. You'll eat because I said you will. And because you deserve to be a kid. She didn't nod. She didn't smile. She just blinked slowly like she was trying to decide whether she could believe him. Nathaniel stood and approached the bed, gently placing his hand on Gloria's shoulder. She needs care, he said quietly. Not just sympathy, real care. Doctors, nurses, a proper bed. She doesn't want to go to a hospital, Ellie said quickly. She thinks if she leaves here, she won't come back. Then I'll bring the care to her, Nathaniel replied. That night, he called his private doctor and arranged for a team to assess Gloria's condition. He contacted a friend who ran a foundation for at-risk children and began the process of securing Ellie a place in a school that could offer her not only safety, but challenge, stimulation, and joy. He ordered groceries to be delivered immediately and set up a temporary bank account to manage the family's needs until a long-term plan could be established. But more than logistics, he made a promise to himself and to Ellie. He would not abandon them. He would not solve a problem and walk away. That part of him, the part that had always retreated behind titles and spreadsheets, was done. What began as an interruption in his routine had revealed a truth he could no longer ignore. The empire he built meant nothing if it could not protect the smallest people living within its walls. Before he left that evening, he knelt again beside Ellie and said, "Tomorrow morning, I'll take you to school, and I'll come back here every day until your grandma gets better. Do you understand?" She looked at him, then at her grandmother, then back. For the first time, her voice was quiet, unsure. "Do you promise?" He nodded. "With everything I have." She didn't answer. She simply walked over and wrapped her small arms around his waist. He stood there frozen as her thin frame pressed into him. And in that single moment, Nathaniel Grant, the untouchable CEO, felt something shift so profoundly in his heart that he knew nothing, no success, no accolade, no luxury would ever compare. The next morning, Nathaniel arrived at apartment 3B, just after 7, dressed not in his usual suit, but in jeans and a navy pullover, a quiet signal that today was not about business. He carried 2 warm bags of breakfast, fresh pancakes, scrambled eggs, and orange juice, and a brand new school backpack, still wrapped in plastic. When Ellie opened the door, still wearing her oversized t-shirt and sleepy eyes, she looked surprised but not confused, as if some part of her had expected him to return, even though no one ever had before. "Good morning," he said, offering the food first. "Breakfast made by real chefs. I figured you could use something better than crackers today." She took the bag with both hands and peered inside. Her eyes lit up, though she tried to hide the expression behind a neutral nod. "Thanks," she said quietly. While she ate at the small table, Nathaniel stepped into the other room to check on Gloria. A nurse he had arranged the night before was already there, gently adjusting the older woman's pillows and taking notes on a clipboard. Gloria was awake, if only barely, and murmured something incoherent when he greeted her. The nurse looked up and nodded. "She's stable, but very weak. We'll get her comfortable. It'll take time, but she's strong." Nathaniel stood silently for a moment, watching the scene, struck again by how fragile everything in this space felt. And yet, within that fragility, there was a strange kind of strength. He turned back to find Ellie at the table, her plate nearly clean, the juice half gone. She was watching him now, waiting. "Ready for your first day?" he asked. "I don't have school clothes," she replied without shame, just fact. "You do now," he said, placing the backpack in front of her. She unzipped it slowly, pulling out neatly folded jeans, a soft blue sweatshirt, socks, and shoes in her size. At the bottom, she found a small pencil case filled with new supplies, and a notebook with her name already written on the cover in careful handwriting. He had asked his assistant to prepare it all that morning, but it had been Nathaniel who chose the items. He'd never shopped for a child before, but for some reason, he had known exactly what she'd need. "Thank you," she said again, quieter this time. There was no performance in her gratitude, no wide smile or hugs, just honesty, the only language she trusted. Once she changed, they walked to the car waiting downstairs. Ellie sat in the back seat, her hands clutching the backpack tightly as the driver navigated through morning traffic. Nathaniel rode beside her, offering bits of explanation about the school. It was a small private institution with a flexible curriculum and a strong support system. He'd spoken to the director himself the night before, ensuring they understood Ellie's background and needs. There would be counseling available as well as academic evaluation to place her in the right level. The school had even offered a gentle buddy system, pairing her with another child to help her adjust. Nathaniel didn't know why the detail had mattered so much to him, but it had. At the school entrance, Ellie hesitated. She didn't cry or cling. She just looked up at him with those deep brown eyes and said, "What if they don't like me?" "They don't know you yet," he said gently. "Give them a chance to find out who you are. That's all you have to do." She nodded once, took a breath, and walked through the gates. Nathaniel stayed in the car for a long time after she disappeared inside, thinking not just about her, but about himself, about how this had become more than a temporary act of kindness. It was something he couldn't step away from anymore. Ellie had become part of his days, his thoughts, his sense of purpose. She had shifted something fundamental in him, and he knew deep down that whatever happened next, she would not face it alone. Later that afternoon, after finishing a brief round of calls with investors and a postponed board meeting, he returned to the apartment. The nurse greeted him with a tired but genuine smile. "Your presence is making a difference," she said, gesturing toward Gloria. "She responds more when Ellie's happy." It helps. He sat down beside the bed and took Gloria's hand. She stirred, turning her head slightly toward him. Her eyes fluttered open just enough for a sliver of recognition to register. "She's going to be okay," Nathaniel whispered, not sure if she could hear, but needing to say it. "I promise you, she's going to be okay." That evening, when Ellie returned, her cheeks were flushed with something that looked a little like joy. She didn't say much, but she dropped her backpack on the chair, kicked off her shoes, and announced, "I got to write my name on a chalkboard." He smiled, pouring her a glass of water. "That's a pretty big deal." "It is," she agreed. They ate dinner together, take-out sandwiches, nothing fancy. But for the first time, the meal felt like a ritual, like something that belonged to them. When she finished eating, Ellie sat beside him on the couch and leaned slightly into his arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. And Nathaniel realized that the quiet moments, the ones without speeches or promises, were the ones that meant the most. He didn't have to say he cared. She already knew. A week had passed since Ellie started school, and in that time, everything Nathaniel thought he knew about the pace of life began to shift. Meetings still came and went. Boardrooms still demanded his authority. But his mind now operated on a second clock, one that revolved around morning drop-offs, after-school pickups, and the sound of a small girl's voice recounting how she learned the difference between sympathy and empathy from a story her teacher read aloud. He had never been a man to memorize routines that didn't concern profit. But now he knew exactly when Ellie's math quiz was scheduled and when Gloria's medication needed to be refilled. He hadn't planned for any of this. And yet, the more the days filled with these details, the more the emptiness in his life seemed to fade. Gloria's health remained fragile, but she was more alert now, speaking in full sentences on good days and even requesting simple meals. The nurse visited daily, and Nathaniel made sure she had everything she needed, from new bedding to a comfortable wheelchair that could move easily around the apartment. He didn't just want to help Gloria recover physically. He wanted her to feel respected again, like someone whose years of service hadn't been forgotten or discarded. Every time he saw her nod slowly while Ellie spoke or hold her granddaughter's hand in silence, he felt something stir inside him, a quiet reassurance that he was beginning to do something right. Still, despite the small victories, a part of Nathaniel remained unsettled. He had made decisions quickly, driven by instinct. But now that the dust had settled, he began to ask himself why. Why this child? Why her story? Why did one knock on a hotel room door undo years of distance he had so carefully built? The answer revealed itself not in a single epiphany, but in fragments, like when he watched Ellie carefully color in the lines of a school project with unwavering focus, or when she stood on tiptoe to reach the kitchen sink and rinse her own plate. She carried herself like someone who never expected help, never relied on promises, and he found himself wanting to prove that some people kept theirs. One evening, as the sky turned a warm pink and gold, Nathaniel sat across from Ellie at the small table in their apartment. She was scribbling in a notebook, her tongue peeking out slightly in concentration. He noticed a line she had written and tilted his head. "What's that for?" he asked, pointing to the phrase at the top of the page. "My Family, a story by Ellie Thompson." She shrugged without looking up. "It's for class. We're supposed to write about who we live with and how they help us." "And what did you write?" She looked up, her expression unreadable. "I wrote that I live with my grandma. And now you." He felt something tighten in his throat, but he didn't let it show. "Do you want to read it to me?" She hesitated, then turned the notebook around and slid it toward him. In her uneven handwriting, she had written, "My name is Ellie, and I live in a small place, but it is warm. My grandma is very sick, but I help her, and she still loves me. I used to clean rooms because we didn't have anything." Then one day, a man opened a door. He didn't yell. He didn't tell me to leave. He asked if I was okay. He said I should be a kid. I didn't believe him, but he came back. He keeps coming back. Nathaniel stared at the words, then looked at her, unsure how to respond. She looked down again, continuing to write as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had. In those few simple sentences, she had put into words what he couldn't admit out loud, that she had changed him. And he was starting to change her, too. That night, after she had fallen asleep, curled on the couch with a worn book in her hands, Nathaniel made a phone call he had been avoiding. It was to a lawyer he trusted, someone who handled sensitive matters discreetly and thoroughly. "I need to talk about guardianship," he said. "Temporary at first, but I want to begin the process." He hung up the phone and sat alone for a while. The hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the wall clock the only sounds in the apartment. This wasn't about generosity anymore. It wasn't even about making things right. It was about belonging to something, to someone in a way he never had before. And as he stood to check on Ellie, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, he realized that she had already given him something he never expected to find again. Purpose. Not for a quarter, not for a corporation, but for life. It had been just over a month since Nathaniel had stepped into Ellie's world, and although the days often passed in a blur of new routines, quiet dinners, and medical updates, something steady was beginning to take root beneath all the change. There was a rhythm now, a subtle but unmistakable rhythm to their lives that hadn't existed before. Every morning started the same. Nathaniel would wake early, prepare breakfast while Ellie dressed in her school uniform, and they would sit together at the kitchen table, not always talking, but always sharing the moment. Ellie had started to hum sometimes when she ate. And while she never acknowledged it aloud, Nathaniel noticed. It was a small sign, but it meant something was healing. Gloria's condition remained fragile, but she was lucid more often, and the nurse reported that her vitals had improved. The improvement brought with it a deeper sense of stability in the home. Nathaniel had converted part of the apartment into a better medical setup, a reclining bed, soft lighting, shelves stocked with supplies, and a folding chair where Ellie often sat to read aloud after school. She still asked hard questions sometimes, the kind no child should have to carry. What happens if Grandma doesn't wake up tomorrow? Would Nathaniel still stay if things got harder? But slowly, those questions began to fade into the background, replaced by moments that felt more like a real childhood, homework spread out on the table, crayon drawings on the refrigerator, and giggles that occasionally echoed down the hall. One afternoon, Nathaniel picked Ellie up from school earlier than usual. When she stepped outside and saw him waiting by the car, her eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Am I in trouble?" she asked cautiously. "Not at all," he said, smiling as he opened the door for her. "I just thought we could do something different today." She studied him for a second, trying to read his expression, then climbed into the car without another word. They drove to the city library, a quiet glass building tucked between office towers. Nathaniel had called ahead to arrange a tour and a temporary library card just for her. When they walked inside, Ellie's eyes grew wide. She had never been to a place like this. Aisles and aisles of books, endless rows of stories, tall windows that poured in natural light. She walked slowly at first, running her fingers over the spines, then looking back at him as if silently asking if this was real. He nodded. "Anything you want. Take your time." They spent almost 2 hours there, moving through sections filled with fantasy, biographies, science books with big photos, and silly trivia. Ellie eventually chose 4 books to borrow, cradling them in her arms like treasures. On the ride home, she barely spoke, too focused on flipping through the first pages of one titled "The Girl Who Found the Sky." Later that night, while Ellie was busy drawing in her notebook, Nathaniel stepped into the kitchen where the nurse was finishing up her notes. She gave him a thoughtful look. "She's different around you, you know," the nurse said. He leaned against the counter, curious. "How so?" "She's softer, less guarded. It's not just comfort, it's trust. You've become her safe place." He nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. He didn't take them lightly. He thought back to the conversation with his lawyer earlier that week. The paperwork had begun to move. Guardianship, background checks, statements of intent. Everything was in motion now, not as a favor, not as an emergency fix, but as a decision he was fully committed to. He had sat for hours writing a personal letter for the case file, trying to explain why a man like him, who had once prided himself on keeping people at a distance, was now choosing to become the father figure to a child he hadn't known a month ago. The answer hadn't been easy to put into words, but somewhere in the letter, he had written a single sentence that felt the most honest of all: "Because I'm not doing this for her to belong to me. I'm doing this because I finally know what it means to belong to someone." As the nurse left for the evening, Nathaniel returned to the living room. Ellie had fallen asleep on the couch, one book still open in her lap. Her drawings lay scattered on the table. One of them, a house with 2 windows, a stick figure with a tie, and a girl holding a book under a tree. In messy handwriting above the roof, she had written, "My home." Nathaniel sat beside her, careful not to wake her. He looked down at the drawing again and felt a kind of peace settle into his chest. Not because things were perfect, but because for the first time in a long time, they were honest. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But he knew this much. He wasn't walking away. Not from Ellie. Not from this life, not from the version of himself that finally made sense. It was a rainy Saturday morning when Nathaniel received the call. The guardianship hearing had been officially scheduled just under 3 weeks away. As he stood by the window, watching the water streak down the glass in gentle trails, he felt a surprising mix of anticipation and nerves. He had faced high-stakes meetings with billion-dollar outcomes, spoken in front of world leaders and investors. But nothing had ever felt quite like this. This wasn't about profit or power. It was about permanence. It was about being chosen, not by a board, not by shareholders, but by a child who had once knocked on his hotel room door holding nothing but a rag and quiet defiance in her eyes. Ellie was still asleep when he returned to the kitchen, curled up on the couch beneath her favorite green blanket. Her hair was tangled from sleep, and a small stack of books rested beside her pillow. She had been reading more lately, absorbing worlds far beyond her own, and every night she told him a new fact she'd learned, or a strange dream that her books had inspired. Her mind was blooming with possibility, and he knew now, without a shred of doubt, that this was where he belonged. By mid-morning, Gloria had asked to sit up for breakfast. The nurse helped prop her up with pillows, and Nathaniel joined her at the edge of the bed. He had learned how to read the quiet lines in her face, the slight narrowing of her eyes when she was in pain, the subtle twitch of her mouth when she found something amusing. That morning, she watched him closely, then motioned for him to come closer. "She told me what you're doing," Gloria said, her voice still thin but clearer than it had been in weeks. "The court, the papers." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I thought you should know." "You're giving her a life I couldn't," she said, her tone flat, but not unkind. "I raised her on prayer and grit. But I knew I couldn't protect her forever." "You protected her more than most ever would," he said sincerely. "You kept her alive. You gave her love. Everything else I'll try to take from here." Gloria studied him with eyes far sharper than her body let on. "You won't run. I won't even step back." She closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them again and offered the smallest nod. In that quiet approval, he felt the weight of something sacred, something he hadn't earned, but would carry with everything he had. Later that day, he took Ellie out to a small bookstore downtown. The rain had eased into a soft drizzle, and they walked beneath a single umbrella, her hand tied around his. She didn't ask where they were going. She had stopped asking weeks ago, somehow already trusting that wherever he led her, it would be safe. The bookstore was narrow and dimly lit with wooden floors that creaked and shelves that stretched to the ceiling. It smelled like paper and warmth. Ellie lit up the moment they walked inside. She wandered off instantly, her fingers brushing gently against the spines of books as if they were living things. Nathaniel watched from a distance, letting her explore, letting her feel ownership over a space that belonged to her curiosity. He found her sitting cross-legged on the floor near the back corner, reading silently. She didn't notice him approach until he crouched beside her and asked, "Find something good?" She held up the cover. "It's a story about a girl who built a flying machine out of scraps and dreams." "That one's you," he said softly. She rolled her eyes. "I don't build machines. You build futures. That's harder." She studied him for a long second before asking, "Are you nervous about the court?" "Yes," he answered honestly. "Me, too." They sat in silence for a while, side by side among the books. Nathaniel realized that she wasn't looking for reassurance anymore. She was looking for honesty, and he owed her that more than anything. When they returned home that evening, they found a surprise waiting on the table, a framed drawing. Gloria had asked the nurse to help her prepare it while they were gone. It was Ellie's artwork from weeks ago, the one with the house and the tree and the figures drawn with love. But now, it was framed in a simple wooden border, and beneath it, in Gloria's careful handwriting, were the words, "*Family isn't given. It's chosen star. Nathaniel stood staring at it longer than he meant to. Ellie looked up at him and said, "I think Grandma gets it." He nodded slowly. "I think we all do." That night, as he tucked her into bed, she whispered, "Even if something goes wrong in court, you'll still be here, right?" He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Nothing's going to go wrong. But yes, no matter what, I'll still be here." And for the first time, she didn't respond with another question. She just closed her eyes and let herself fall asleep because she believed him, and that meant everything. The courtroom was quiet, more understated than Nathaniel had imagined, with pale walls, polished floors, and the soft hum of ceiling fans spinning slowly overhead. There were no flashing cameras, no grand declarations, just a small bench, a judge with tired but kind eyes, and a few rows of chairs where social workers, attorneys, and family members waited in near silence. Nathaniel sat at the front, dressed in a tailored navy suit, not because he wanted to impress, but because he knew that today mattered. Beside him sat Ellie, wearing the pale yellow dress she had picked out herself, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked around the room with quiet curiosity, but there was a nervous stiffness to her shoulders, the kind that didn't come from fear of strangers, but from the worry that this too might be temporary. The judge called the case to order, and everything began with a low formal murmur. Statements read aloud, documents submitted, assessments presented. Nathaniel listened carefully, absorbing every word, though his attention kept flicking back to Ellie, to her stillness, to the way her legs dangled from the bench without quite reaching the floor. When it was his turn to speak, he stood, took a steady breath, and faced the bench. The judge asked him a series of questions. His relationship to the child, his understanding of the responsibilities of guardianship, his intentions moving forward. Nathaniel answered each one with clarity, without hesitation. He spoke not like a man reading from a prepared script, but like someone who had lived every word. He explained how they met, how it wasn't by design, how it began with a knock and a child holding a rag instead of a toy. He talked about what he had seen, the apartment, the illness, the quiet strength of a little girl doing the work of someone 3 times her age. He admitted with full honesty that he hadn't known what he was doing at first, that all of it was unexpected, but that something changed in him the moment he saw how fiercely she fought to survive. He told the court that his decision to seek guardianship was not an act of charity, but of love, of commitment, of belonging. When he said the words, "She is my family now," his voice did not shake. It simply settled into the room like a truth that had always existed. When the judge looked down at Ellie, she tilted her head and asked, "Do you want to live with Mr. Grant?" Ellie looked at Nathaniel, then back at the judge. Her voice was small, but certain. He came back. No one ever came back before. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Then the judge smiled gently and said, "That will be part of the record." It wasn't immediate, but it was final. The motion for guardianship was approved. When they stepped out into the hallway afterward, the late morning sun was pouring through the windows, making the floor shimmer with soft light. Ellie reached for Nathaniel's hand. And for the first time, he didn't have to offer his first. She held it tightly, swinging it slightly as they walked, her small smile blooming slowly into something brighter. They didn't speak much during the drive home. They didn't need to. When they returned to the apartment, Gloria was awake, waiting. The nurse had already told her. She greeted them with open arms, and Ellie ran into her grandmother's embrace with the energy of a child who had been holding her breath too long. Nathaniel stood nearby, giving them space. But Gloria reached for his hand, squeezed it once, and whispered, "Thank you for choosing her, for letting her choose you." That evening, Nathaniel cooked dinner himself. Pasta, garlic bread, and Ellie's favorite, steamed carrots with honey. They sat together at the small kitchen table, the 3 of them eating not like guests in each other's lives, but like people who had always belonged at the same table. There was laughter that night, loud and full. There were second servings and one spilled glass of milk that no one got mad about. After dinner, Ellie handed Nathaniel a folded piece of paper. He opened it slowly and found a drawing of a house, not unlike her first one, but this time with a fourth figure added to the Stick family, a tall man holding a little girl's hand, both of them smiling beneath a big uneven heart. Written across the top in bright red crayon was a single word, home. Nathaniel looked up and saw her watching him. He didn't say anything. He simply opened his arms and she ran into them. Her small body pressed tight against his chest. In that quiet, perfect moment, Nathaniel Grant, once a man defined by luxury and solitude, became something far more extraordinary, a father not by blood, but by choice. And that, he knew now, was the truest kind. In my view, the ending of this story is powerful because it doesn't rely on grand twists or dramatic revelations. It finds its emotional weight in quiet choices and honest change. Nathaniel's transformation is not sudden or showy. It's steady, earned through everyday moments of presence, listening, and responsibility. That's what makes it feel real. Ellie's journey from guarded survivor to a child who finally feels safe enough to draw a picture of home is the emotional core of the story. It reminds us that true love isn't built on promises made in crisis, but on consistency, on the willingness to stay when it's easier to leave. What I love most about the conclusion is that it honors every character's strength without erasing their pain. Gloria doesn't get a miracle cure. Ellie doesn't forget what she's been through. And Nathaniel doesn't become someone else entirely. He simply becomes the best version of himself. It's a story about how one unexpected encounter can open the door to everything you didn't know you needed. And in the end, it's not about saving someone. It's about saving each other. That's what makes it unforgettable. Black struggles. Voiceover ends with a reflective tone.